July 1945, San Francisco Harbor. 17-year-old Robert Kelley stood on the deck of the hospital ship USS Benevolence, watching the Golden Gate Bridge emerge through the morning fog, his hands gripping the rails so tightly his knuckles turned white. He weighed 93 pounds, 40 pounds less than when Japanese forces captured him on Bataan 3 years earlier. His teeth were loose from scurvy. His legs bore scars from tropical ulcers that had eaten through muscle to bone. He couldn't remember the last time he had slept more than 2 hours without waking in panic. Around him, other former prisoners of war lined the rails, boys who had lied about their age to enlist, teenagers who had survived the Bataan Death March, the hell ships, the labor camps, the starvation and disease and systematic brutality that killed thousands of their older comrades. They were coming home as the first teenage American prisoners of war in modern history, carrying wounds that doctors could document and other wounds that had no name yet, wounds that would shape and shatter their lives for the next 60 years. The crowd on the dock cheered and waved flags. Bands played patriotic music. Photographers captured scenes of joyful reunion. But Kelley felt nothing except the cold certainty that the boy who had enlisted at 15 to escape a broken home in rural Iowa no longer existed. And the hollow thing wearing his name had no idea how to pretend to be human anymore. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. The story of American child soldiers in World War II exists in the uncomfortable margins of military history, acknowledged but rarely examined in depth. The United States military officially required enlistees to be 18 years old for general service, 17 with parental consent. But enforcement of age verification was inconsistent at best, deliberately lax at worst, particularly in the months immediately following Pearl Harbor, when recruiting stations were overwhelmed and the country demanded immediate military expansion. Thousands of boys between 14 and 17 lied about their age, forged birth certificates, or simply walked into recruiting offices and stated they were old enough, relying on the recruiter's willingness to look the other way. Some joined seeking adventure and glory, influenced by propaganda and cultural notions of heroic masculinity. Others fled poverty, abuse, or dysfunctional families, seeing military service as an escape route from impossible situations. The military accepted them, trained them, shipped them overseas, and put them into combat alongside men sometimes twice their age. When the war ended and these boys came home, if they survived, society had no framework for understanding what they had experienced or what they had become. The concept of childhood trauma, of developmental psychology, of post-traumatic stress disorder as a recognized medical condition did not exist in 1945. The boys were expected to simply readjust, to be grateful they survived, to get on with their lives as if 3 or 4 years of combat captivity or occupation duty were just an interruption to be forgotten rather than a defining crucible that had fundamentally altered their psychological development. Robert Kelley had been 14 years old when he forged his older brother's birth certificate and enlisted in the Army in September 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor. His father was an alcoholic who had abandoned the family. His mother worked 16-hour days in a canning factory and had neither the time nor the emotional capacity to provide structure or affection. Robert was failing in school, drifting toward delinquency, hungry most of the time, angry all the time, desperate for any escape from the grinding poverty and hopelessness of Depression-era rural America. The Army offered 3 meals a day, clothing, purpose, and the promise of becoming something more than a forgotten poor kid with no future. The recruiter who accepted his forged documents almost certainly knew the birth certificate was fraudulent, but chose not to inquire too closely because quotas needed filling, and the boy was tall for his age and seemed physically capable. Robert completed basic training at Fort Ord, California, then advanced infantry training, and by December 1941 found himself assigned to the 31st Infantry Regiment stationed in Manila, Philippines. He turned 15 3 days before Japanese forces bombed Pearl Harbor and invaded the Philippines, beginning a campaign that would end with the largest surrender of American forces in history. The next 4 months were a compressed nightmare that aged Robert a decade. The 31st Infantry fought a desperate delaying action as Japanese forces pushed American and Filipino troops down the Bataan Peninsula. Food ran out within weeks. Medical supplies were exhausted. Malaria and dysentery killed men as surely as enemy bullets. Robert, still officially listed as 18 in Army records, but looking like the frightened child he actually was, served as a runner and ammunition carrier, sprinting between positions under fire, watching men die from wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical care, slowly starving as the daily ration dropped to less than 1,000 calories of half-spoiled food. On April 9, 1942, when American forces on Bataan finally surrendered, Robert weighed maybe 110 pounds and was suffering from the early stages of beriberi and dysentery. He joined 75,000 other prisoners in what became known as the Bataan Death March, a forced movement of 65 miles to Camp O'Donnell, where Japanese forces interned the survivors. The march killed somewhere between 5,000 and 18,000 men, the exact number lost in the chaos and mass graves. Prisoners who fell behind were bayoneted or shot. Those too sick to walk were left to die on the roadside. Water was scarce. Food was non-existent. The tropical heat and humidity made every step an agony. Robert survived by staying near the middle of columns, helping carry wounded men when his own strength allowed, and developing a dissociative mental state where he simply stopped thinking about anything except placing one foot in front of the other, a psychological survival mechanism that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Camp O'Donnell was death in slow motion. Dysentery, malaria, beriberi, and other diseases kill hundreds of prisoners daily. The Japanese provided almost no food, no medicine, no sanitation. Prisoners died faster than burial details could dig graves. Robert spent 3 months at O'Donnell before being transferred to Covenant One, a larger camp where conditions were marginally better due to the prisoners' own efforts at organization and discipline. He worked in labor details, hauling logs and digging ditches, his teenage body wasting away on a diet of rice contaminated with weevils and occasional spoonfuls of vegetable broth. He watched friends die. He watched older men, veterans of World War I, tough professional soldiers, simply lose the will to live and lie down and never get up again. He learned that survival was as much psychological as physical, that the men who made it were those who could find some reason to keep going, whether faith or family, or just pure stubborn refusal to give the enemy the satisfaction. Robert's reason was anger, a burning rage at the injustice of everything that had happened to him, anger at his father for abandoning the family, anger at his mother for failing to protect him, anger at the recruiter who had accepted his forged papers, anger at the army for sending him to this hell, anger at the Japanese for the systematic cruelty, anger at himself for not being stronger or smarter or luckier. That anger kept him alive when kindness or hope would have failed. In October 1944, as American forces began retaking the Philippines, Japanese commanders decided to evacuate prisoners to Japan and other occupied territories for use as slave labor. Robert was packed into the hold of a transport ship with 1,700 other prisoners in a space designed for perhaps 300. The hell ships, as prisoners called them, were floating death traps. Men died from suffocation, dehydration, disease, or were killed when American submarines and aircraft, unaware the ships carried prisoners, torpedoed or bombed them. Robert's ship survived the voyage to Japan, but more than 200 men died in the hold during the 2-week journey. Upon arrival, Robert was sent to a labor camp near Osaka, where prisoners worked in war industries. 12 to 14 hours a day in factories and dockyards, still starving, still dying, but at least out of the tropics where disease had been an equal threat to enemy action. The work was brutal. The guards were brutal. But Robert had by this point developed the psychological armor of the long-term prisoner, the ability to mentally separate from his body, to endure without breaking, to survive one day at a time without thinking about tomorrow or yesterday. He turned 17 in that camp. He barely noticed. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Robert had been a prisoner for 3 years and 4 months, nearly a quarter of his entire life to that point. American forces entered the camp, provided food and medical care, and began the process of repatriation. Robert remembered almost nothing of the next several weeks. Medical records show he was treated for severe malnutrition, anemia, multiple parasitic infections, and what was described as nervous exhaustion, the closest term available at the time for what would later be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder and complex developmental trauma. He was placed on a hospital ship with other seriously ill former prisoners and transported to San Francisco. The voyage took 3 weeks. Robert spent most of it in a fog of dissociation, unable to process that the war was over, that he was free, that he would see America again. Other survivors described a similar emotional numbness, an inability to feel joy or relief, as if the capacity for positive emotion had been burned out by years of unrelenting horror. The cheering crowds and celebration when the ship docked felt surreal, a scene from someone else's life that Robert was watching from a great distance. The Army discharged Robert after 3 months of hospitalization and rehabilitation at Letterman General Hospital in San Francisco. He received back pay, veterans benefits, and a train ticket to Iowa with instructions to report to a local Veterans Administration office for follow-up care if needed. He was 17 years old. He had no high school diploma. He had no job skills except infantry tactics and how to survive on 400 calories a day. He had no family except a mother who barely recognized the gaunt, haunted stranger who appeared at her door claiming to be her son. The Army had provided no counseling, no transition program, no acknowledgement that Robert's developmental years had been spent in conditions of sustained trauma that would affect every aspect of his future psychological and social functioning. He was expected to simply readjust, to become a normal teenager, to finish high school and get a job and build a life as if the previous 4 years had been an unfortunate but ultimately manageable interruption. The impossibility of that expectation became apparent within days. Robert couldn't sleep in a bed. The softness and enclosure triggered panic attacks. He couldn't eat normal portions of food. His stomach had shrunk and normal amounts caused painful cramps. He couldn't tolerate crowds, loud noises, or sudden movements. He flew into rages of perceived disrespect or threats. He had flashbacks triggered by random stimuli, the smell of rice cooking, the sound of men shouting in languages he didn't understand, the sight of someone in uniform. He drank to numb the constant anxiety and hypervigilance. Within 3 months, he had been arrested twice for fighting. Within 6 months, his mother asked him to leave, unable to cope with his behavior, and unwilling to accept that her son needed help beyond her capacity to provide. Robert's story was not unique. Across the country, hundreds of teenage former prisoners of war and combat veterans were experiencing similar disintegration as they tried to reintegrate into a society that had no understanding of childhood military trauma. The Veterans Administration, overwhelmed with millions of returning servicemen, focused its limited resources on physical disabilities and obvious psychiatric cases. Boys like Robert, who appeared physically healthy after recovering from malnutrition and disease, fell through the cracks. The diagnostic categories available in 1945 and 1946 were inadequate for describing their conditions. If they were diagnosed at all, it was usually as psychoneurotic or having a constitutional psychopathic personality, terms that suggested inherent weakness or character defects rather than trauma-induced injury. Treatment, when offered, consisted primarily of brief hospitalization and sedatives, with the expectation that time and willpower will resolve the symptoms. The concept of severe trauma during critical developmental periods could cause lasting changes in brain structure, emotional regulation, and social functioning was decades away from scientific validation. These boys were expected to simply grow out of it, to man up, to stop dwelling on the past, advice that was worse than useless because it added shame and self-blame to their already overwhelming psychological burden. Robert drifted for the next several years, moving from town to town, taking temporary labor jobs, living in boarding houses and missions, drinking heavily, getting into fights, occasionally arrested for minor offenses, and released when his veteran status earned sympathy from judges who didn't know what else to do with him. He tried twice to finish high school through night classes but couldn't concentrate or complete assignments. He tried vocational training programs but couldn't maintain the focus and discipline required. He had relationships with women but couldn't sustain them. His emotional volatility and inability to trust driving away anyone who tried to get close. By his early 20s, Robert was living the chaotic existence of someone with untreated complex PTSD and developmental trauma, cycling through jobs, relationships, and living situations, never quite homeless but never stable, self-medicated with alcohol, avoiding anything that might trigger memories of captivity, and slowly accepting that the normal life he saw other people living was simply not available to him. He was not alone in this experience. Follow-up studies conducted decades later on former teenage POWs showed rates of divorce, unemployment, substance abuse, and premature death significantly higher than both the general population and older POWs who had been adults when captured. The younger the prisoner at the time of capture, the worse the long-term outcomes, a finding consistent with modern understanding of how trauma, during critical developmental periods, disrupts normal psychological maturation. The turning point for Robert came in 1953, 8 years after his liberation, when he encountered another former Bataan prisoner at a construction site in Denver. The older man, recognizing the signs of someone struggling with war trauma, invited Robert to attend a meeting of former prisoners who gathered monthly at a VFW hall. Robert attended reluctantly, expecting either maudlin nostalgia or judgmental preaching about moving on with life. Instead, he found something he hadn't experienced since liberation: understanding without explanation. The other men, most of them 10 to 20 years older than Robert, didn't need him to explain why he couldn't sleep or why certain sounds triggered panic, or why he sometimes felt overwhelming rage at trivial frustrations. They had experienced the same things, carried the same invisible wounds, struggled with the same inability to articulate to outsiders what it meant to have survived the camps. For the first time since coming home, Robert felt less alone. He kept attending meetings. He started talking, haltingly at first, about his experiences. He listened to other men's stories and recognized his own pain reflected in their words. The meetings didn't cure him. Trauma doesn't work that way. But they gave him a framework for understanding his symptoms as injuries rather than personal failings. And they gave him a community of people who could tolerate his worst moments without judgment or abandonment. The camaraderie with other former prisoners provided Robert with something therapy and medication couldn't have offered in that era: validation that his struggles were a reasonable response to unreasonable circumstances, and practical strategies for managing symptoms developed by other men who had faced the same challenges. He learned from older veterans how to structure his days to minimize triggers, how to recognize the warning signs of approaching flashbacks or panic attacks, how to find employment in industries that valued reliable physical labor over social skills or emotional stability. He found work in construction, operating heavy equipment, jobs where his hypervigilance and attention to danger were assets rather than liabilities, where the physical exhaustion helped him sleep, and where his co-workers accepted emotional distance as normal rather than pathological. He married in 1955, a woman he met through the sister of another former prisoner, someone who understood from the beginning that Robert came with complications and limitations. The marriage survived, barely, through decades of his nightmares, emotional withdrawal, periodic drinking binges, and inability to discuss his feelings or experiences with anyone except other former prisoners. Robert's wife later described their relationship as like living with two different people: the functional man who went to work and paid bills and could be kind and gentle in calm moments, and a traumatized boy who appeared without warning, unreachable, and sometimes frightening during flashbacks or anniversary reactions. Robert and his wife had 3 children. He was not a good father by any conventional measure. He was emotionally distant, unable to show physical affection, prone to angry outbursts over minor misbehavior, alternately overprotective and neglectful. But he provided materially, never drank around his children, and instilled in them a fierce work ethic and sense of responsibility. His children grew up knowing their father had been a prisoner of war, but knowing almost nothing about what that actually meant, because Robert never discussed it with them. The one time his oldest son asked about the war, Robert's face went blank and he left the house for 3 hours, returning without explanation. The children learned not to ask. They learned to watch for signs that their father was having a bad day and to stay out of his way. They learned that he was different from other fathers, but that the difference was connected to something important and painful that must not be questioned. This pattern of silence and emotional unavailability transmitted trauma across generations in ways that wouldn't be understood or studied until long after Robert's children had grown up and started noticing their own difficulties with emotional regulation and trust. The 1970s brought the beginning of real change in how American society understood and treated war trauma, driven primarily by the flood of Vietnam veterans experiencing symptoms similar to those Robert and his generation had suffered through in silence. The diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder was formally adopted in 1980, providing for the first time a medical framework that recognized trauma as causing specific, treatable psychological injuries rather than revealing character weakness. Veterans Administration hospitals began developing specialized PTSD programs. Academic researchers started conducting longitudinal studies of former prisoners of war, documenting the long-term effect of captivity and the factors that influenced outcomes. Robert, by then in his 50s, learned through his former prisoner support group about a VA study seeking participants who had been teenage POWs. He enrolled, underwent extensive medical and psychological evaluation, and for the first time in his life, heard a doctor tell him that his symptoms were recognizable, documented, and not his fault. The relief was overwhelming. For 35 years, Robert had believed on some level that his inability to adjust to normal life reflected a personal failure, a weakness that other men didn't have. Learning that his experiences were consistent with recognized medical condition, that other teenage prisoners showed the same patterns, that the trauma had occurred during critical developmental years when his brain was still forming, reframed his entire self-understanding. Robert began formal treatment for PTSD at age 53, nearly 4 decades after the trauma that caused it. Progress was slow and incomplete. Decades of maladaptive coping mechanisms and neurological changes couldn't be undone quickly, if at all. But therapy gave him tools for managing symptoms more effectively. Medications helped reduce the intensity of hypervigilance and intrusive memories, and the simple validation of having his suffering recognized as real and significant provided a measure of peace he had never expected to feel. Robert became active in veterans advocacy, speaking to high school classes about his experiences, testifying before congressional committees about the need for better screening and treatment of combat trauma, and mentoring younger veterans struggling with PTSD from more recent conflicts. The boy who had survived by swallowing his emotions and disconnecting from his pain spent his later years trying to help others avoid the isolation and silence that had defined most of his life. It wasn't redemption exactly. Trauma doesn't offer neat narrative arcs, but it was purpose and connection, two things that had been largely absent during the decades when he drifted through life unable to explain to anyone, including himself, why everything felt so difficult. The stories of other teenage former POWs from World War II followed similar patterns with individual variations. Some, like Robert, eventually found stability through peer support and later through formal treatment once it became available. Others never recovered, dying prematurely from suicide, substance abuse, or stress-related medical conditions. A few seemed to adjust relatively well, though closer examination usually revealed carefully constructed facades hiding significant ongoing symptoms. The factors that distinguished better outcomes from worse were complex and still not fully understood. Strong social support, meaningful employment, ability to connect with other survivors, access to treatment once it became available, and individual resilience factors all played roles. But one finding was consistent across studies. The younger the age at capture, the worse the long-term prognosis. Boys captured at 14 or 15 showed significantly worse outcomes than those captured at 17 or 18, and all teenage prisoners showed worse outcomes than adult prisoners from the same camps. The developing adolescent brain, still forming critical structures for emotional regulation, social behavior, and identity formation, appeared uniquely vulnerable to the effects of sustained trauma. What would be severe injury for an adult was catastrophic for a child. The American military's use of underage soldiers in World War II was never officially acknowledged as a policy failure requiring systemic response. Individual cases were documented. Some boys who were discovered to be underage during service were sent home, but no comprehensive review was conducted to determine how many children had enlisted, where they served, what happened to them, or what their long-term outcomes were. The cultural narrative of World War II as a good war, with clear moral stakes and ultimate victory, left little room for uncomfortable questions about whether the United States had sent children into combat and captivity, and then abandoned them to deal with the consequences alone. The boys themselves, aging into men and then into elderly veterans, largely kept silent about their age at the time of service, partly from a sense that it somehow diminished their sacrifice, partly from lingering shame about having lied to enlist, partly because American culture had no framework for discussing childhood military trauma in terms other than weakness or failure. Only in recent decades, as historians began examining the personal stories behind the broad statistical narratives of the war, did the experiences of teenage soldiers begin to receive serious attention. Robert Kelley died in 2008 at age 81. His obituary noting his service in World War II, his 40 years in the construction industry, and his survival by his wife of 53 years and 3 children. It did not mention that he had been 14 when he enlisted, 15 when captured, or that he spent most of his life battling invisible wounds from experiences that should never have happened to a child. It did not mention the nightmares that continued until his death, the hypervigilance that made him check door locks multiple times each night, the anniversary reactions that appeared every April 9th on the date of Bataan surrender, or the fact that he never fully escaped the prison camps, even though his body came home in 1945. His children spoke at his funeral about a complicated man, difficult to know, sometimes difficult to love, but fundamentally decent, and try his best with resources he didn't have to manage damage he couldn't articulate. One son mentioned that near the end of his life, when dementia began eroding his carefully constructed defenses, Robert sometimes believed he was still imprisoned, asking for water in a panicked voice, or calling out names of men long dead, and that in those moments the elderly man in the nursing home bed disappeared, and what remained was a terrified boy who had never fully made a home. The broader lesson, if there is one, involves recognizing that war trauma in children creates damage that persists across entire lifespans and affects not just the child who experienced it, but family and community networks around them. Modern military policy in most developed nations prohibits the use of soldiers under 18, a standard codified in international law, to the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But implementation remains inconsistent, and non-state armed groups around the world continue to recruit and deploy child soldiers in significant numbers. The research on former American teenage POWs from World War II, limited as it is, provides one of the few longitudinal datasets on what happens to child soldiers after conflicts end and they attempt to reintegrate into civilian society. The findings are grim: high rates of mental illness, substance abuse, homelessness, incarceration, failed relationships, unemployment, and premature death. These outcomes are not inevitable. Early intervention and sustained support can significantly improve prognosis, but without such intervention, the trajectory toward dysfunction and suffering is depressingly consistent. Robert's generation of teenage soldiers never received that intervention. They came home to a country focused on celebrating victory and moving forward, not on examining the hidden costs of how that victory was achieved. They were expected to be grateful for surviving, to be proud of their service, to transition smoothly into productive civilian lives. When they couldn't meet those expectations, when the trauma manifested in ways that disrupted normal functioning, they were told implicitly and sometimes explicitly that they were failing at something others managed easily, that time and determination should be sufficient to overcome whatever difficulties they faced. That message, delivered by a culture that didn't know better but caused harm nonetheless, added layers of shame and self-recrimination to already overwhelming psychological burdens. Many of these men spent decades believing they were uniquely weak or damaged, unaware that their struggles were predictable consequences of having experienced severe sustained trauma during critical developmental years, unaware that with proper support and treatment their lives might have been significantly different. The handful of researchers who studied former teenage POWs in detail found a pattern they termed frozen development or arrested adolescence, where critical aspects of psychological maturation that normally occur during the teenage years, identity formation, emotional regulation, establishment of intimate relationships, career planning, simply didn't happen or happened in distorted ways. The boys went into captivity at 14 or 15 and emerged at 18 or 19, having spent the intervening years in survival mode, where normal developmental tasks were impossible. Then they were expected to immediately function as adults without having completed the psychological scaffolding that supports adult functioning. Some eventually caught up, working through delayed developmental tasks in their 20s or 30s with varying degrees of success. Others never did, remaining in some fundamental way the frightened, traumatized children they had been in the camps, even as their bodies aged and external circumstances changed. This pattern has implications far beyond World War II, relevant to understanding modern child soldiers, victims of childhood abuse, refugees who spent developmental years in camps or conflict zones, anyone whose childhood was consumed by trauma and survival with no opportunity for normal psychological growth. In 2003, when Robert was 76 years old, a researcher from a university conducting oral histories of former prisoners of war interviewed him for a project documenting teenage POW experiences. The interview, archived in the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, runs nearly 4 hours and represents the most complete account Robert ever gave of his wartime experiences and their aftermath. Listening to the recording is painful. Robert's voice is rough from years of smoking, his speech sometimes halting as he searches for words or stops to compose himself when emotions threaten to overwhelm. He talks about being 14 and desperate to escape Iowa, about lying to a recruiter, about the initial excitement of Army life before everything went wrong. He talks about the surrender, the Death March, the camps, the specific horrors he witnessed in detail that would be inappropriate to fully recount here. And then he talks about coming home, and his voice changes, becomes almost angrier than when describing Japanese brutality, because at least in the camps he understood why he was suffering and who was responsible. Coming home and discovering that he couldn't function, that the America he had dreamed about during captivity didn't have a place for damaged boys, that people, including his own family, couldn't or wouldn't understand what he'd been through. That felt like a second betrayal, somehow worse than the first. Near the end of the interview, the researcher asks Robert what he wishes people understood about his experience. Robert is silent for nearly 30 seconds, long enough that the interviewer starts to ask another question before Robert interrupts. He says, and this is close to verbatim from the transcript, that he wishes people understood that children who go to war don't come back as children, but they don't come back as adults either. They come back as something between, something broken that doesn't fit anywhere, and that if society is going to take children and use them in war, then society has an obligation to help them become human again afterward, not just thank them for their service and expect them to figure out the rest on their own. He says that for 50 years he felt like he was pretending to be a normal person, studying other people to learn how to behave, mimicking emotions he saw them express but couldn't feel himself, and that only in his 70s, after decades of therapy and medication and support groups, did he begin to actually feel like a real human being rather than a ghost walking through someone else's life. He says he doesn't blame the Japanese soldiers who guarded the camps. They were following orders in a brutal war. And he doesn't even really blame the Army for accepting his forged papers. The country needed soldiers, and he volunteered. But he does blame, and his voice breaks here, the indifference that met him when he came home, the lack of curiosity about what had happened to him, the expectation that he should be fine, because he looked fine, the decades of suffering alone with wounds no one acknowledged existed. That, Robert says, was the real crime. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. Robert Kelley's story, painful and unresolved as it is, at least ends with some measure of recognition and support in his later years. Not all teenage former POWs were so fortunate. The Veterans Administration estimates, based on incomplete records, that somewhere between 300 and 800 American servicemen captured during World War II were under 18 at the time of capture. Of those, perhaps 2/3 survived captivity and returned home. Follow-up on their long-term outcomes is fragmentary and mostly anecdotal. Death certificates and VA records suggest mortality rates significantly higher than both general population and adult former POWs, with notable spikes in suicide, alcohol-related deaths, and stress-induced cardiac events. Divorce rates were approximately double the already elevated rates for adult combat veterans. Employment history showed patterns of instability, frequent job changes, periods of unemployment, and concentration in physical labor occupations that didn't require significant social interaction. Criminal justice system involvement was higher than average, mostly minor offenses related to alcohol or fights, but sufficient to add another layer of difficulty to already complicated lives. These statistical patterns, dry and clinical in research papers, represent hundreds of individual tragedies, men who came home carrying damage they didn't have words to describe and never received adequate help to heal. The final irony is that some of the teenage former POWs who struggled most with civilian reintegration found relative stability by remaining in military culture through service organizations, veterans groups, and community networks centered around military identity. Robert Kelley spent more time at the VFW Hall and former prisoner reunions than he ever spent with civilian friends. The military social structure, with its clear hierarchies, explicit rules, and shared understanding of war trauma, provided a framework that civilian life lacked. Men who couldn't maintain marriages or steady employment could function effectively within veterans organizations, taking leadership roles, organizing events, mentoring younger veterans. The identity of former POW or combat veteran, while carrying painful memories, also offered respect, community, and purpose that many found nowhere else. This pattern suggests that the failure wasn't in the individuals, but in civilian society's inability to integrate people whose formative experiences were so radically different from normal developmental trajectories. Modern understanding of developmental trauma offers insights that might have helped Robert's generation if that knowledge had existed in 1945. We now know that severe trauma during adolescence disrupts the maturation of brain structures involved in emotional regulation, impulse control, and social behavior. We know that these effects can persist for decades but are responsive to appropriate treatment, particularly approaches that address both the trauma memories and the developmental deficits created by having critical growth years consumed by survival rather than normal maturation. We know that social support, particularly from others who shared similar experiences, is often more effective than individual therapy alone. We know that shame and self-blame significantly worsen outcomes, while validation and education about the nature of trauma can facilitate healing. All of this knowledge came too late for most of Robert's generation, developed in part by studying their suffering but not in time to prevent it. The question of moral responsibility for what happened to teenage soldiers like Robert Kelley is complex and implicates multiple actors. The boys themselves bore some responsibility for lying about their age, though the concept of informed consent is questionable when applied to 14-year-olds making life-altering decisions. The recruiters who accepted obviously fraudulent documents bear responsibility, though they were operating under enormous pressure to meet quotas in a national emergency. The military system that failed to provide adequate screening, and that later failed to provide adequate treatment bears responsibility. The broader society that created conditions where children felt military service was preferable to remaining home, and that later failed to recognize or address the needs of traumatized young veterans, bears collective responsibility. And specific individuals, officers who sent teenage soldiers into combat knowing their age, medical personnel who documented obvious trauma, but provided no treatment, VA administrators who denied benefits or support, bear individual responsibility for specific failures of duty. But assigning blame, while perhaps satisfying, does nothing to help the men who lived through these experiences or prevent similar failures in future conflicts. What helped, in the cases where anything helped, was connection and validation, other survivors who understood without explanation, professionals who recognized trauma as injury rather than weakness, family members who could tolerate the symptoms without taking them personally or demanding immediate recovery. Robert's wife, for all the difficulties of their marriage, never gave up on him, never demanded that he simply get over it, never made his trauma about her inconvenience. That steady presence, frustrating and insufficient as it must have felt to both of them at times, probably saved his life. The other former prisoners who welcomed him into their community in 1953 probably saved his life. The VA clinician who evaluated him in the 1980s and told him his suffering was real and documented probably saved his life. These moments of recognition and acceptance, small in the grand scheme, but enormous to Robert personally, made the difference between a life of complete dysfunction and a life of partial functionality, between dying alone and bitter or dying surrounded by family and having contributed something meaningful in his later years. The story of American teenage prisoners of war from World War II is fundamentally a story about what happens when societies fail to protect children, then fail to help them heal, and finally fail even to acknowledge that harm occurred. It's a story about resilience and survival. Yes, because these boys did survive against terrible odds, and many eventually built lives of some stability and meaning. But it's equally a story about unnecessary suffering, about trauma that could have been prevented or at least addressed more effectively, about the cost of societal indifference to invisible wounds. Robert Kelley and others like him paid that cost in decades of pain, failed relationships, missed opportunities, and lives lived in emotional exile from the world around them. Their children paid in growing up with traumatized fathers who couldn't provide the emotional connection children need. Their wives paid in years of walking on eggshells, managing symptoms, and living with men who were present physically but often absent emotionally. The cost compounded across generations and relationships, rippling outward from the original trauma in ways that no one fully calculated or even recognized until decades later. If this story moved your heart, even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him,